Since the 2020 general election, to date in Korea, there have been 10 public elections, including the 2020 general election, and we believe they have all been rigged. This documentary illustrates the struggle of ordinary citizens who are trying to shed light on this by digging up evidence of alleged election fraud in Korea. Many countries, including the United States, have suffered from allegations of election fraud. What is noteworthy about how we believe the Korean election fraud works is that a specific political party plans, a government agency implements, the Supreme Court covers up election frauds, and advanced information technology is used in these crimes. The following are the scenarios of election fraud that ordinary Korean people have uncovered on their own. The Democratic Party creates an election blueprint. From this blueprint, they run simulation software programmed on the National Election Commission server to inflate the vote count. The vote count is inflated through several methods such as manipulating electronic counting machines, inserting fake ballots, or switching ballot boxes. The Supreme Court covers up these crimes by nullifying the recount. Of course, this hypothesis cannot be confirmed until the investigative agency forensically examines the National Election Commission servers and computer equipment. However, we believe it is the most persuasive hypothesis after analyzing the evidence collected thus far by citizens in the field, and over the next 30 minutes, we will lay out this evidence that supports our hypothesis. Many people were shocked by the results of the 2020 Korean general election, where the Democratic Party won by a large margin despite the even polls. Under Korean election laws, a voter can decide between casting their votes on election day or during the 2-day early vote period. Many citizens suspect that setting aside 2 days for early voting sets the stage for bad actors to perpetrate election fraud. The morning after the 2020 election, a Democratic Party staff member and political strategist posted this on his social media account. A table showing the number 163, which he bragged was the Democratic Party's prediction of the number of seats they would obtain, which later we found was the exact number of seats, along with an exact match in breakdown by constituency. And look at the table's title, Early Vote Manipulation Value. People began to wonder, could there be more to the 2020 general election results? Could it be, as this table suggests, that the early vote had been manipulated and served as a blueprint to the Democratic Party's plan to win the election? As social media users began to question the integrity of the post, it suddenly disappeared. Evidence that the Democratic Party may have planned the election in advance also emerged in the most recent 2024 elections. In an article in the Donga Ilbo, the Democratic Party said it was aiming for an overall voter turnout of 71.3%, including 31.3% in early voting. But even more surprising is that the early voter turnout in the 2024 general election was 31.3%, exactly the same as the Democratic Party's prediction. What political party sets a target election turnout to the exact decimal point? At this point, you may recall the 2020 general election blueprint with the exact prediction of all constituencies, which the Democratic Party strategist posted and deleted after controversy arose. How could the Democratic Party know the election results and voter turnout so accurately in advance? And what does the early vote manipulation value written in the Democratic Party's election blueprint mean? Our hypothesis about the early vote manipulation value is this. This manipulation value varies depending on the target number of constituency seats when the Democratic Party simulates the election results. For example, if the Democratic Party and the Conservative Party's constituency seats are set to 50-50, then the manipulation value is 1. The manipulation value for the 2020 general election was 1.71, targeting 163 seats. Plus, a list of Democratic Party candidates who must be elected and candidates from the opposing party who must be defeated are also set in advance. Based on the opinion polls in each constituency, the predicted voter turnout and the manipulation value, the number of early votes is inflated and distributed to each constituency. The election simulation blueprint planned by the Democratic Party is implemented by the National Election Commission, and we believe the two are working hand in hand by using the system of early voting to inflate the vote count based on the Democratic Party's planned election blueprint. This creates fake vote numbers as there is not enough time to inflate the vote count on Election Day. These inflated fake votes create strange numbers that are statistically impossible. And the National Election Commission announced these fake vote numbers, claiming they were the election results.
In the election day vote should be close to the early vote. It is a general rule of statistics. But my statistical analysis of the vote result of the 2020 general election gave me strong confidence that this election is fraudulent.
That was Professor Ho Byung-ki, author of Secret Command, a statistical analysis of the 2020 election's vote manipulation. He looked at the data released by the National Election Commission and compared them to the 2016 election results. The horizontal line is the difference between the early vote versus election day votes. The vertical line represents the number of constituencies. If there are more early votes, the bar is to the right of 0. If there are more election day votes, the bar is to the left. In 2016, the votes were clustered around the center for both parties, meaning there was little difference between the number of early votes and election day votes, which come from real voters with no known manipulation. But in 2020, the blue bar representing the Democratic Party was entirely on the right side of 0, which means in every single constituency, they got more early votes than election day votes. The red Conservative Party, the exact opposite. Not only that, the graph is a mirror image with a 10% shift of votes in either direction. The other minor parties represented by the bars in the middle means their votes were not part of the manipulation.
It is 100% vote fraud, since when I calculated the possibility of this vote result, it turned out to be almost 0. The result of the 2020 general election reported by the NEC is not possible in a real-life election.
Professor He said the likelihood of achieving a result like this, with tens of millions of real-life voters, is equivalent to tossing 253 coins in the air and having them all turn up heads. This graph shows the national results of the 2024 general election. Red are the seats won by the Conservative Party, and blue are the seats won by the Democratic Party. In many instances, the Conservative Party won in the election day vote, but as you can see in the early vote, the results were overturned in favor of the Democratic Party. It's especially apparent in the metropolitan area. Despite winning so many constituencies in the election day vote, the early vote results were overturned in favor of the Democratic Party in all constituencies, except 1 in Seocho-gu and 3 in Gangnam-gu. Had the early vote not been manipulated, this would have been virtually impossible to achieve. In the 2020 general election, many observers reported seeing the Conservative candidate winning in the election day vote. But then the results reversed as early vote ballot boxes began to open late at night. You may remember the incident during the 2020 U.S. presidential election when Donald Trump was winning in all the swing states until midnight. But when the mail-in ballot boxes that arrived early the next morning were opened, a flood of votes for Biden poured in, overturning the election results and giving Biden a victory. Immediately after the recent 2024 general election, the National Election Commission conducted a voter awareness survey, which asked the voters how they voted, either in the early vote or on election day. 38% of the voters responded that they chose to vote early. However, according to the 2024 NEC vote records, 47% were early votes, a difference of 9% between actual voters' responses and NEC vote records. That's about 4.26 million votes. Considering this survey was conducted by the National Election Commission, they must have an answer to the burning question on everyone's mind. What is the reason for this vast discrepancy? Many suspect that this 9% was inflated by the National Election Commission. Unlike election day votes, it's not required to keep printed registers, so anyone can go to a polling station and cast an early vote. Furthermore, the National Election Commission's voting manual has a clause that says, "Cover all CCTVs if installed in the voting locations," which makes it impossible to check the number of early voters or any other illegal activity, such as multiple voting or proxy voting around the voting locations. In other words, in case of early voting, the number of votes can be inflated at will. To inflate the number of early votes, simulation software programmed into the National Election Commission server is used. As for voting systems that cannot verify the actual number of voters, Elon Musk posted this. Mail-in and drop-box ballots should not be allowed, as cameras would at least prevent large-scale fraud by counting how many people showed up versus ballots cast. In the recently held 2024 general elections, more evidence of computer-rigged elections have emerged. The Democratic Party inadvertently told the press about the target voter turnout rate they had set in advance, which ended up being their downfall. In this election, the Democratic Party set the early vote turnout through simulation, but the election day vote turnout was lower than the target, so the actual voter turnout was only 67%, about 4% lower than the Democratic Party's target of 71.3%. Therefore, it was inevitable that there was a gap between the number of votes on the National Election Commission server and the actual vote count at the counting site. There are many cases reported where there is a difference between those two numbers. The simulation program adjusts the number of voters in real time on voting day according to the actual voter turnout. The following video shows the National Election Commission servers making such voter count adjustments in real time. On Election Day, April 10, 2024, citizens who monitor the election are continuously scanning the number of voters announced by the National Election Commission on their website by time zone. Surprisingly, the numbers seem to decrease at various points during Election Day. Suddenly, the number of voters drops to 0, and sometimes the number of voters does not increase at all. After 37 minutes has passed at 4:44 p.m., the number of voters finally changes, but it doesn't increase. It decreases significantly from over 13 million votes casted to 4.7 million, and then another change. The numbers start going up again, increasing from 8.1 million to 13 million. And the fine-tuning of voter counts doesn't stop there, but continues even after the vote count closes. These drastic changes in the vote count suggest that the Election Commission's announcement is not the result of the votes actually being counted, but rather the result being fabricated by a computer program. since the National Election Commission announces the number of votes fabricated by simulation. This accounts for the difference between the number of people the NEC says voted and the number of votes counted. In the early vote, the exact number of paper ballots distributed to the voters should be drawn and counted from the ballot box. However, in the recent 2024 general election, many constituencies had discrepancies between the distributed and the counted ballots. In some cases, not all distributed ballots were found in the ballot box, while in others, there were more ballots in the ballot box than had been distributed to the voters. A voter turnout of over 100% is clear evidence of rigging, as it was in many constituencies in the 2024 general election. At this point, Venezuela, where violent protests have recently erupted over alleged election fraud, comes to mind. The voter turnout there was also over 100%. The question now is, how did they actually implement the vote fraud? The simulated results are manipulated at the counting site using electronic counting machines. These are hundreds of ballots from one constituency going through a counting machine. Ordinarily, the ballots should appear in random order. But you can see that they are all marked for the Democratic Party candidate. You may recall from these over 100 consecutive Democratic vote scans the so-called Biden spike, a strange phenomenon that occurred in Wisconsin and Michigan between 4 and 6 a.m. on November 4th, the day after the 2020 U.S. presidential election. When the vote counting, which had been halted around midnight, resumed, a sudden spike in Biden votes was observed. Of the over 100,000 votes counted at that time, more than 90% were for Biden, and similar phenomena that occurred in Korea and the U.S., which defy the basic laws of statistics, can only be explained by election fraud. We wondered if the ballots had been pre-sorted. But in the NEC's counting manual, there is a warning not to count already sorted ballots to avoid the possibility of inflating votes. In an interview with Jung-ang Ilbo in the 2020 general election, one of the major newspapers in Korea, the counting observers in the Buyo constituency told the reporter that they suspected that the electronic counting machines were fraudulently sorting ballots to benefit the Democratic Party. They said, when they demanded an explanation, the clerk responded by reluctantly rebooting the laptop connected to the electronic counting machine. Minutes later, they say the result flipped between the parties. Similar incidents also happened with other counting machines, and as a result, eventually flipped the winner in the Buyo constituency. According to the target votes inflated and manipulated by the NEC computers, fake paper ballots were made and inserted into the ballot boxes. Take a look at this counting clerk separating paper ballots that are stuck together. Why are they stuck together when each ballot is cast separately? The NEC gives a nonsense explanation that the ballots stuck together by static electricity. And this, bundles of votes that look like they just came out from the mint. How is that possible for votes that go through many hands? And the NEC doesn't just stop at manipulating votes, it also controls the opinion polls, which is used to convince the public to accept fraudulent election results. This QR code contains identifying codes for each voter. When the ballot goes through the electronic counting machine, the voter's personal information, as well as who that person voted for, is input into the NEC's computer database. Now the NEC has access to this information, which is unconstitutional, and then supplies this information to opinion poll companies, leading to suspicions that the NEC has been interfering with public opinion polls. However, to date, there have been no investigations conducted into this allegation. Following the 2020 general election, The Supreme Court received 139 recount requests nationwide, but they only granted several. 1. In the Incheon, Yeonsu constituency, filed by the one parliament member who challenged the vote results, Min Kyung-ug of the Conservative Party who lost his seat. By law, recounts must take place within 6 months of the election. This recount took over a year.
Every time we opened the early ballot box, we found an unbelievable number of what appeared to be fake ballots in the box. When I saw this, I got goosebumps and couldn't believe my eyes.
These are the fake ballots that Attorney Yoon mentioned. And earlier, we showed you ballots that were so crisp and clean, they looked like they had just come from the mint. Those two were discovered in the recount evidence box. Listen to the explanation from the NEC's promotional video.
This ballot uses paper that is made of a special material that can bounce back to its original form without creases. Therefore, this cannot be an example of evidence that real ballots were replaced with fake ones.
If we are to believe what this video claims, then what about the other ballots in the box that remain creased? And then there's this, the voting clerk's seal, which should be clearly visible with a name and a place, smudged beyond recognition. More than half of the 1,900 ballots cast in a town in Incheon Yeonsu constituency were discovered this way. Voting clerks testified under oath that they had not stamped these ballots or even seen these ballots before, but the Supreme Court justices ignored this testimony. Listen to this printing expert with over 40 years of experience who participated in the Incheon Yeonsu constituency recount.
I approached the 3 Supreme Court justices and told them that the paper ballots in the recount were not the genuine ones cast by voters, but printed and cut in print shops. But Justice Cho Jae-yeon turned his head away and refused to listen.
There were also some truly bizarre incidents where ballots that were clearly present at the polling station and at the counting station did not show up in the recount. These ballots were clearly recorded in the voting book as having been cast by the voters. However, these ballots were not found in the recount. This is strong circumstantial evidence that the ballot boxes were replaced before the recount. In July 2022, Supreme Court Justices Chun Dae-up, Jo Jae-yeon, and Yi Dong-won dismissed the recount lawsuit of Min Kyung-ug, justifying their decision in a Supreme Court opinion that the plaintiff named the National Election Commission as a defendant and, quote, couldn't pinpoint an actual offender or describe how the crime was perpetrated. They also wrote, quote, it is not a fraudulent election since no criminal would leave such obvious evidence. In addition, under the law, a Supreme Court justice must serve as the head of the National Election Commission. But if the National Election Commission is a defendant in a lawsuit, how is it constitutional for that judge to preside over a case in the Supreme Court? Many began to question the objectivity and motivations of the Supreme Court. It's easy to see with the naked eye that the paper ballots are fake. Verifying their validity is simple by examining them with a loupe or weighing them. But the Supreme Court justices wouldn't consider taking that extra step to cover up any allegations of wrongdoing.
The National Election Commission printed fake ballots, matching the fabricated vote numbers, and created new ballot boxes. Before the recount, they replaced the real paper ballots cast by voters with these prepared ballot boxes and discarded the real ballots by shredding or burning them. The Supreme Court justices all saw those fake ballots with their own eyes. even though they knew what was going on, they made the conscious decision to cover it up.
그냥 듣기로 결정한 겁니다.
The strongest evidence that the Supreme Court justices were covering up voter fraud is that they refused to open the ballot boxes for what is called the proportional representation vote. This is when voters pick their preferred party versus the candidate. Despite election laws that stipulate that recounts must happen within 180 days of a request, it took over 3 years to hold the recount trial for proportional representation votes. Even then, Supreme Court Justice Min Yoo-suk illegally dismissed the case without even opening the ballot boxes for a recount. The National Election Commission appears to have failed to precisely match the number of proportional representation ballots to the simulation before the recount. So if the ballot boxes had been opened and checked, there would have been a big discrepancy from the result announced by the NEC. In such cases, the fraud was so obvious that Justice Min Yoo-suk desperately tried to block the recount. In the general election of Korea, a voter receives 2 ballots voting for the constituency representation and also for the proportional representation. The proportional representation voting is to select the voter's preferred political party. Since the National Election Commission simulation program is designed to inflate early vote counts of constituency voting, proportional representation vote counts should match these numbers. In the 2024 general election, there were only 400,000 invalid votes in constituency voting, but 1.3 million invalid votes in proportional representation voting, more than 3 times that number. Due to time and technology constraints, the National Election Commission appears to have used mostly invalid ballots for proportional representation voting, while it used counterfeit ballots for constituency voting. The number of invalid votes for proportional representation in the 2024 general election reached a record high of 1.31 million. And many observers of the vote counting testified that they saw empty ballots that had not been marked for candidates thrown out in mass at the counting site. After the 2024 general election, the judiciary illegally denied all requests by candidates to preserve evidence for a recount. This means that there is no longer any legal post-election verification in this country. Other than a small number of those who are speaking out against the stolen election, most Koreans are staying silent, including the current president Yoon Suk-yeol, who took an oath of office to protect the country from constitutional violations. He is ignoring the people's demands to investigate election fraud crimes in 10 previous elections. All but one of them took place during his administration. Vote fraud is not just a crime. It's a matter of national security, particularly given recent North Korean aggressions under the strong protection and support of the Chinese Communist Party. And we believe that China played a role in the fraudulent 2020 elections. 9 months before the 2020 general election, the head of the Democratic Party's research think tank, Yang Jong-chol, paid a 4-day visit to China, where he met with high-ranking members of the Chinese Communist Party and flew to Shenzhen to visit the world-famous tech company, Tencent. And not only that, an accountant named Roy Kim discovered the Chinese Communist Party's slogan, "Follow the Party," programmed and hidden in the ASCII code in the 2020 general election data announced by the NEC. He discovered the algorithm which the programmer used to plant these hidden codes in the NEC data. Also, numerous fake ballots were found in the count and recount, and those low-quality fake ballots are believed to have been hastily produced in third countries, such as China.
Canadians have been hearing and reading a lot about the issue of attempted foreign interference, particularly from China, in our elections.
It is well known that Chinese Communist Party has been interfering in other countries' recent elections, such as Canada. From these circumstances, people worry that Korea's national security and constitution are threatened by election fraud. As the president of a country under such threats, it is clear dereliction of duty in terms of national security not to order an investigation into vote fraud, which we discovered through multiple evidence. In fact, during his own presidential election, this video shows at dawn NEC employees opening the sealed mail-in early vote ballot boxes and stuffing them with unidentified ballots. The NEC claims these are mail-in ballots, but the problem is that there is no way to verify the authenticity of these ballots. Tampering with sealed ballot boxes is illegal, and the seal should leave a trace when removed. Take a look at this video.
The NEC claims that the seal would leave marks when you remove it, but it does not. That doesn't make sense. It's ridiculous.
My apologies.
It should not be a matter of apology. See? That's absurd.
Huh? No marks?
How come?
I will go and raise an objection.
Even the victim of the 2020 elections, the Conservative Party, is denying the existence of vote fraud, dismissing citizens' demands to investigate as conspiracy theories and going so far as to muzzle its own parliament members when they bring allegations of voter fraud. But many parliament members themselves are also choosing to keep their mouths shut, despite that Korea's democracy is on the brink of collapse due to election fraud. Many citizens believe that these politicians are staying quiet with the attitude of, I got elected, so it doesn't matter. Or, if I don't bow to the establishment, I ruin my chances for re-election. This kind of opportunistic attitude takes precedence over patriotism for the country or a sense of responsibility for the voters who voted for them. Listen to Han Dong-hoon, who was in charge of the recent 2024 general election campaign for the Conservative Party.
I personally do not believe in the conspiracy theory of vote fraud because there is no evidence of vote fraud in the 2020 general election.
Even the media is complicit. No major media reported any stories during the 2020 election recount, even as multiple instances of fraudulent ballots were discovered and evidence showed that the NEC and the Supreme Court justices were working together to cover this up. Only a few minor media agencies attempted to report on the subject. After the 2020 elections, a number of civic groups attempted to press charges against the NSC. But to date, there has been no investigation or indictments from police or prosecutors. Nearly everyone, from government officials to academia, seems to be avoiding the subject of voter fraud, despite the overwhelming evidence we laid out before you. Their silence shows that they are putting their own interests ahead of the vested interests of Korean society. In the famous words of Martin Luther King Jr., the ultimate tragedy is not the oppression and cruelty by the bad people, but the silence over that by the good people. For the Korean people who have watched this video until now, to restore the collapsing constitutional democracy of our country, which will you choose, silence or resistance?